When it comes to story, video games tend to have a relatively poor reputation. It's easy to dismiss them as just being playthings, and many are not really designed to be much more than that. But within the format of a video game, storytelling requires a much different approach than other media, and games don't always get the recognition they deserve for these efforts. There are many interesting narrative options unique to video games that do make them an effective medium for the telling of meaningful stories. The best stories in games are those that embrace the medium. Much of the substance in the stories of video games arises from what is imparted upon the player through gameplay. Gameplay is often considered to be entirely discrete from story, but it is, in fact, a crucial storytelling tool for video games. Video games are intended to be played for the narrative to be properly felt. Just as you can't simply read a movie's screenplay as if it were a novel, and properly appreciate the art, evaluating the story of a game without the gameplay being factored in, like if you were to watch a composition of a game's cutscenes or a long play, leaves important context out of the experience. Cinematography is to the stories of movies as gameplay is to the stories of games. It's an important element that can't be neglected without every other aspect of the story suffering. There are a lot of great stories that simply could not have been told in any recognizable way in a medium besides video games, and that usually comes down to how they integrate the gameplay with their narrative. Much like how the score of a movie can project the intended tone upon a scene, gameplay can be used to evoke and amplify the appropriate player reactions. Gameplay isn't just there for fun, it will often make you feel a certain way, and ideally that feeling is aligned with the narrative so that the gameplay and story reinforce each other. A game might have you holding a desperate defense against a relentless enemy, with the level designed so that you feel the desperation, like your position is about to be overrun at any second, and you constantly feel the pressure to react quickly and efficiently. Or you can feel the thrill of narrowly avoiding detection while sneaking around, or the subsequent shock of getting caught, which helps bring a sense of constant danger to the narrative. You can feel the grace of being saved by a powerful ally joining the fight on your behalf, and you might feel indebted to them. The fact that most games have a threat of failure for the player, the understanding that you can suffer some consequence if you make a mistake, builds into a sense of tension unmatched by other media, which can really make a player appreciate the sweetness of victory or pain of defeat. In these examples and countless more, games immerse the player in the setting and tune the gameplay to fit the narrative impression that the story is going for. Let's look at the example of horror games. The horror genre was a natural fit for games because in video games you always have skin in the game, progress to lose. They can make you feel pretty tense even when they're not specifically designed to be scary. So when they actually do have their tone, atmosphere, and gameplay tuned to that end, they can have a huge impact on people. It's important for any game to preserve the integrity of its tone and gameplay. So in the case of a game that's supposed to be scary, if playing it just made you feel like an awesome, indestructible cool guy, if it's not difficult or tense and you don't feel vulnerable, the entire intended narrative is unraveled due to this tonal inconsistency. So what some games did was punish you for wasting resources. With strictly limited resources, you can't just fight your way through every enemy without defeating yourself in the long run, but you usually can't just avoid every enemy. Some resources need to be spent, so you have this constant fight or flight dynamic built on preservation of resources, and it's often unclear which option is the right call. This uncertainty is a crucial pillar of the tension that goes into survival horror games. And that brings us to the first game I'm going to talk about specifically. Resident Evil is a great example of a game that might be easily dismissed as a candidate for having a good story. It's pretty goofy in a lot of ways, and it's kind of notorious for that. So what could possibly be praiseworthy about a story like this? Well, it's good where it counts. The gameplay in particular goes a long way towards narrative building. Ultimately, the game succeeds at what it primarily sets out to make players feel, and most people remember the game as being pretty scary and pretty intense, even if it has a lot of ridiculous B-movie moments. In Resident Evil, tension doesn't come from wondering who betrayed you, it comes from wondering if you're going to be in danger on the other side of a door. It's compelling because of the gameplay scenario you're in and what that makes the player feel. The real horror is finding out you don't have any more ammo or ink ribbons, making every combat encounter treacherous and a potential long-term setback where you don't know if you can afford to waste ammo on a zombie that's about to grab you, and that can be a terrible, painful decision. and it's one that you'll probably have to make many times. You might think you're better off just working around the zombies, which could save you ammo, but it's also a decision that could come back to bite you in a sense. Every zombie you see could hurt you later on, because you have to travel through each area multiple times. On the other hand, you will probably screw yourself over and make the game unwinnable if you just kill everything you see at first sight. You have to be smart, saving your ammo and healing items for when you need them. But the right call isn't always clear, and you can make costly mistakes very easily. Even saves are limited, making those mistakes very punishing. The mindset players feel in these moments is what the game's really about. There's a reason the Spencer Mansion, where the game takes place, is such an icon of gaming. When you're exploring the mansion, you never feel safe or comfortable. Running around aimlessly, making multiple unnecessary trips to the same area, or finding yourself out of resources while you're very far from an item box, a lot can go wrong from poor planning, and this place feels like it's out to get you. The unsettling atmosphere combined with the very real presence of in-game danger and uncertainty makes the mansion a relentlessly oppressive place, deprived of any comfort, keeping players on edge at all times, with one exception. Contrasting all of this is the safe rooms. These are rare places of guaranteed safety, where you're able to store your items, save your game, and comfortably avoid danger. These rooms lend themselves to a contemplative mood because it is there that you are able to weigh your odds as you check your item box and have to make the difficult decisions of what to take with you in your limited inventory space, and consider the classic dilemma of whether you should spend a precious ink ribbon to save or hold out just a little bit longer. The room's unusually calm music and visuals give them a peaceful atmosphere, and it's that stark contrast these rooms have with the rest of the mansion, and how much they mean to a player in gameplay terms, that makes these spaces a memorable staple of the game. And that kind of feeling cannot be conveyed the same way in other media. It's true that a movie or novel can have places of refuge and peace for the protagonist, breaks in the action, giving a sense of ease to the scene, but the connection you feel as a player is different when your life gets easier after the protagonist is able to stock up, heal, reload, and get set for whatever you're planning to do. Anything you see in a movie just isn't the same as getting to the room where you can finally put the controller down without pausing the game. The simple fact that the room is this sanctuary in a hostile environment counts the most, though. The sanctity of the safe rooms is built on the foundation of their gameplay significance. It can be such a great relief to get to the safe room in the nick of time, and when you're on this hallowed ground, the zombies can't get to you. This place is special. These rooms truly are a light shining in darkness, and there's just something oddly beautiful about them. And it comes with knowing there's danger lurking about, that there's a tough road ahead, and you have to go back out there. But for now, you can feel respite. Something else that I think is interesting about games is how you can really identify with a character after walking a mile in their shoes. In this sense, games can use your perspective as a player to get you invested in and accustomed to the story very quickly. You tend to innately empathize with the character you're playing as, so video games can portray a wide variety of perspectives and you can naturally ease into them without necessarily needing any cinematic or verbal explanation as guidance, say to establish who the bad guy is. The bad guys are the ones shooting at you. You understand instinctually that that's a problem. There's no argument to be had. If you don't fight back, you die. This can make for some interesting storytelling that might be used to ask some hard-hitting questions, or just to help with the natural progression of the story without using so many words. Video games give you a chance to vicariously experience something, which makes a story feel that much more personal. A great example of a game using the player character's perspective to tell a story is Call of Duty 4, a game in a series not really known for its high-caliber storytelling. Call of Duty 4 opens with a dictator in the making assassinating the president of a Middle Eastern nation. That synopsis could probably describe a dozen different games easily. Usually it's the kind of thing you'd see in a cutscene, or maybe you'd see a newsreel mention it in the prologue. It's the sort of stakes setting that is often done to give the player a bit more context than who's shooting at you. But in Call of Duty 4, they decided to have the president's perspective be playable before he's killed. He's bound and captive, so the only control you get is to look around. Because it's playable, the sequence puts you on edge. You don't know what's going to happen. You might wonder if suddenly you'll be given a chance to act. Maybe a rescue attempt that thrusts the player into combat and an escape sequence would ensue. So you keep your hands on the controller, ready at a moment's notice. But that sort of moment never comes, and you're marched to your inevitable death. Having the villain put a bullet in your head is a pretty effective way to make the player feel personal distaste for him. Anyway, this event invites an American retaliation. You play as a Marine named Jackson as he fights his way to the antagonist's suspected location. After a substantial portion of the game's campaign spent as this character, you find yourself suddenly evacuating to escape from a likely nuclear detonation that the villain has sprung up as a trap. Witnessing your supporting gunship get shot down below you, you have a Black Hawk Down type situation with a nuke about to go off. The hard decision is made to try to rescue the surviving pilot. Just as it seems that everyone will make it out, you see the nuclear blast quickly engulf your helicopter. The next level begins with Jackson slowly awakening in the crash. It's hard to tell that it's even playable at first, and when you start moving, you move sluggishly as it becomes apparent that Jackson has been heavily injured by the crash, of which he's the sole survivor. Jackson repeatedly stumbles, groaning in agony as he does. Before long, you collapse, too injured to stand and with no ability to save yourself from the radiation. And that's the last we see of Jackson. It was a bitter and poignant moment. The entire campaign was upended here. It feels really bad experiencing a man's final torturous moments as he slowly dies all alone, along with knowing that all the Marines you've seen for the entire campaign probably shared the same fate. Not only that, but it was a cruel punishment for a valorous deed, and it hits harder seeing as this is effectively not happening to some independent character, but to you, or at least a guy you walked a mile in the shoes of. Everyone on the helicopter might have survived if you just shamefully left your fellow Marine behind. The taste of victory, or at least escape, was wrested out of your hands, all for trying to do the right thing. Any memory of the heroic deeds you performed over the campaign is gone in an instant. And then the next level starts a continent away like nothing even happened. The world does not mourn Jackson's death, only the player understands the significance of it. I remember as a kid going back to replay the Aftermath level. I thought maybe there's something I can do to help this guy, maybe a secret to get a different ending. But no, there's nothing on this level but pain and despair. This scene was a landmark moment in gaming, and I'm hardly the first to comment on it, but it did shock me when I first played it. Not only is it bitter and shocking, but Jackson's death also reinforces the personal stake in the conflict for the player, because the villain has personally wronged you twice now as a player. Hunting him down for the rest of the campaign feels like avenging yourself, and there's something cathartic about finally taking him down. One of the most empowering games I've ever played was Sekiro. Sekiro is a game like many others in that it features a hero who gradually claws his way up from the bottom, rising in strength and skill to the point where he can defeat a great rival. A highlight of Sekiro is that it features the player character lose a fight early on. This is a common storytelling choice in games. It's similar to the Call of Duty 4 example in that it's another way of doing things to the player directly to make them feel more involved in the story, just without killing the player character. Seeing the protagonist, a reflection of yourself, get knocked down a peg gives you motivation to see his honor restored. Having you lose an in-game fight as part of the story is also interesting because you don't have to put up with seeing your character make mistakes that you would not have made if it weren't you playing. It would be worse if you were to see your player character lose in a cutscene where your first thought might be to deny it. That wouldn't happen if I were playing. I'd have done something else. I'd have played better, I would have used my healing items, I would have parried. Having a fight be demonstrably unwinnable in-game dispels the player of any such notion. You really are outmatched. It isn't because you lost your in-game plot armor for the sake of a cutscene. It isn't because you did something wrong. You just weren't ready. And this can lead to a more authentic feeling as to the outcome of these kinds of fights, and it makes a potential rematch feel all the more exciting because of the opportunity it provides for the player, to whom it feels vindicating. In Sekiro's case, that's fitting because it's also vindicating for the character who loses everything in the initial defeat. What really completes Sekiro in particular is how it ties the character progression to your own growing level of skill as a player. Fighting your rival for the first time in the prologue is like being a toddler and finding yourself at the 50-yard line in the Super Bowl. I stood no chance when I played. Then I beat the game and tried again with newfound skill and realized the game had actually changed my ability as a player in a substantial way. And that fight went very differently in New Game Plus. It might sound cheesy, but it was like I had realized something within myself thanks to the game. Countless stories have been told about a character unlocking his hidden potential, but it's truly special how Sekiro gives that impression to the players themselves. Sekiro also has a really pronounced difference, even more than most skill-based games, between how the game feels when you're good versus when you're still figuring things out. It's a whole different game. I went through an entire transformation where I started utterly helpless and confused. Then I started trying to turtle these fights and whittle down the boss's HP, and it took forever. But eventually I got good and started landing those parries and saving the dodging for when it was actually necessary, and it was like becoming fluent in a new language. Getting good at Sekiro feels like a superpower. It's like you've unlocked the infinite ammo rocket launcher, but it's not cheating like that. It's a power that was within you all along. You actually gain a real demonstrable ability from the playing of games in this way. And that's part of the story that this game is telling. It intends for you to die a bunch and then overcome that adversity, so that you felt exactly what that character had to go through to reach the end, and so that you earn the glory that comes with it. The footage won't do it justice. You cannot know how much agony these enemies you're seeing have caused me. I can recall saying that these fights must have been impossible, but at this point, I can reliably beat them on my first try, and I feel something from that. Any skill can confer this sort of feeling, but games tie it to a narrative by having it be linked to life or death battles with the fate of something greater at stake. In a more abstract way, this sort of feeling can come from any game that challenges you as a player and teaches you to adapt and overcome, but it's more directly invoked in a game like Sekiro. At some point, when the game finally clicks, it feels like you've awakened to your true inner power. It's really just an awesome feeling, and it's something that's totally irreplicable in other media. It's amazing when a game imparts that sense. Now, a game like Sekiro feels thrilling and rewarding for the role in which it casts the player, but games can also put the player in a position where you might regret your actions rather than feeling so accomplished in them. Especially when games give players no choice but to do something they really don't want to. These games draw players into the narrative and ask that you engage firsthand with tough decisions to be made. It can be really powerful when games give you cause to reflect on your actions in this way. Link's Awakening was the first game I played that made me step back and rethink my actions as a player, making it a formative gaming experience for me. You can steal from the game's shop with a bit of footwork to evade the shopkeeper's sight. This allows you to get his stock for free, which includes highly valuable, important items that happen to be very expensive. You can get the infinite money machine that is the shovel, which is mandatory for certain quests. And you can even acquire the incredibly powerful bow and arrow before you even set foot in the first dungeon. So why wouldn't you do it, right? Well, after you walk out of the store, you get a strangely demeaning message. And the shop owner will kill you, but this is a game where dying doesn't actually make you lose progress, so you keep whatever you stole. No skin off your back. But when characters start talking to you, you'll notice something is off. All characters, from the kind-hearted Marin to the wise and benevolent Owl, refer to you only by the title of Thief, in cutting all caps. You have been branded a criminal for what you've done. There's no second chance to be found, no quest to redeem yourself. Always and forever you will only be known as a thief. And I remember feeling quite insulted and a little upset by this as a kid, because that's a blight on your entire playthrough, a constant reminder of your crime. The lesson, of course, is simply not to steal, although it's a harsh lesson with a temptation that can be difficult to ignore. The game does carry a persistent theme of consequence, putting the player's actions in an unusual light. And this is the first taste of that, you see. As it turns out, the player's actions ultimately prove far more dire than stealing an overpriced shovel. I'm gonna spend the next minute or so totally spoiling this game that's older than I am. The world you inhabit in Link's Awakening is eventually revealed to be the dream of a creature called the Windfish, which has been trapped in eternal slumber. Link's only means to escape the dream and return to Hyrule is to awaken the Windfish and unmake the island of Koholint and everything upon it. Success means the erasure of all the happy villagers, Link's friends, everyone that has helped you along the way, as they are products of the dream. How real they actually are supposed to be is sort of ambiguous, but they are inextricably linked to the dream that you seek to bring to a close. Now, it's not all bad, because you are freeing Link and the Windfish, which is probably a good thing, and all good dreams must come to an end, but the ending is very bittersweet, and I certainly had to spend some time grappling with this when I was like 8 years old. The player is cast in a very interesting role here. The thought will likely occur to you to question whether it actually is for the best that you succeed at all. One thing that really makes a difference is how the player directly engages with the characters in video games, which can make interactions between them and the protagonist feel more personal. Games that give you allied NPCs that are actually useful have a way of resonating with players, and sometimes developers use this to invoke a sense of camaraderie. You help them, they help you. It also helps single-player games feel less like they're isolating experiences. Good companions tend to be the most widely venerated characters in games, and being useful in gameplay might just do more to endear them to fans than having the most well-developed backstory or personality does. Being helpful counts for a lot. When choosing a companion in a game like Mass Effect or Fallout, you're probably going to pick the most useful one over the one whose personality you like the most. From Fallout New Vegas, you have the follower Boone. He's a favorite of mine almost entirely because of how useful he is in the early game. There are a lot of difficult areas that can easily deter low-level players early on, and once you got your boy Boone, well, things get a little easier for you. New Vegas has plenty of interesting characters in it, but there's only a small number of companions, and it's no coincidence that these happen to be some of the most memorable characters in the game. Their role as companions has such a direct impact on the player experience that it elevates the impression they put on the player immensely. After all, they're directly aiding you, in a sense. Now, helping you in-game isn't all these characters have going for them. Every companion in New Vegas comes pre-packaged with a personal quest. So just to prove that this isn't the deciding factor. People remember even little things like the NPC summons in Dark Souls games, characters who have no presence of note in the broader narrative. One of my favorites was Bradley of the Old Guard, who, in addition to being a very strong ally in a really tough part of the game, also has healing powers. When you're low on health, he likes to usher you over so he can heal you. Now, you do have the option to summon real people for co-op in this game, but a character like Bradley is honestly a safer bet. The most famous Dark Souls character is probably Solaire, and while he's more plot relevant than Bradley and other minor summonable NPCs, I don't really remember him for his character development or anything like that. I mostly remember him because he's always there for you, being summonable for some of the toughest fights in the game, even when you don't have the Xbox Live Gold membership to play online. This stuff makes a difference to people, and these characters are a part of your journey. I don't think there's an easier way for a character to win the audience over than by having them carry you through the toughest fights in the game. A game I look back on fondly is Star Wars Republic Commando, where you're expected to rely upon your fellow commandos of Delta Squad to achieve many of the game's objectives, and their helpfulness as well as their personalities endeared them to many fans. They are pretty responsive, with a lot of vocal acknowledgements of various player actions like killing an enemy that's targeting them, rebuking you for friendly fire, and reacting to your commands. They also have a lot of banter between each other. But the team is a useful asset, and not just because they shoot at enemies while you run around, but also that they can perform actions like breaching doors, planting explosives, manning weapons, or alternatively they can cover you while you perform these tasks yourself. Crucially, you don't get an instant game over if you lose all your health while they're around. Instead, you get incapacitated, and your teammates can continue fighting until the area is safe, or immediately rush to bring you back into the fight. A gameplay-centric, character-focused approach like this is a highly effective way to get people invested in a story. All of this is in service of a central theme that Republic Commando is built around, as it's made clear very early on that you're meant to feel an attachment to these characters, with the protagonist being told that they are an extension of himself. In light of this, the game's difficulty is tuned so that most encounters are pretty overwhelming if you try to lone wolf your way through them. You really need to rely on these guys. There are solo sections of the game that serve to demonstrate how much worse it is not to have your brothers around, and it's pretty effective. It's rough not having that safety net. Just to round things out a bit, when I talk about these companions and allies, I don't just mean characters who run around killing enemies by the player's side. These can also be characters who simply converse with the protagonist. They might help you solve some kind of puzzle, or act in some auxiliary supporting role. Or they may otherwise play a role in the story where they assist the player in some way that doesn't revolve around fighting. Like the fairies in Zelda games, and Cortana in Halo, characters who aren't really combat powerhouses but dispense a lot of useful information. It's the kind of role in a story that you as a player might feel a tad grateful for. Another means of storytelling through gameplay is the use of divergent possibilities. The numerous outcomes that can occur due to gameplay choices can provide a great wealth of storytelling opportunities, and it's hard for a story to do this outside of video games in a way that isn't something of a gimmick. Some games use variable outcomes to demonstrate the consequences of your decisions to give greater weight to your actions. This can range from obvious results of a conscious decision to total curveballs caused by something you didn't even think about at the time. Sometimes possibilities can be so varied that one playthrough can have an entirely different story from another, making the game multifaceted and giving good reason to play more than once. To see everything a game has to offer and learn more about the setting, or just to aim for the outcome you think is most satisfying so you can be content in knowing you prevented something bad. A great example is Fallout New Vegas, which has many mutually exclusive factions and associated quest lines. The greatest strength of the game that sets it apart from many others is that these factions are not a simple matter of good and evil. They represent different ideological principles that all have a reasonable claim to legitimacy in the context of a post-apocalyptic society. Moral ambiguity in this fashion is something games are particularly suited for. Even when there is moral ambiguity in another type of story, the events are going to unfold in a single predetermined way. You can't exactly represent, say, the audience's wishes to quite the same extent. The protagonist has their own beliefs and acts upon them in a movie. You might agree or disagree, but you're not the protagonist, so it's not up to you. Additionally, most good stories will naturally have you sympathize with the protagonist, so there's inherently a bias in favor of whatever they believe, feel, and witness. If there's a war going on and the protagonist finds himself on one side, the other side is antagonistic in nature. That's just how storytelling works, even if things are otherwise presented as even-handedly as possible. Whereas in a game like New Vegas, there's no guaranteed, certified antagonist. You can act depending on your perspective of who the heroes ought to be, because the protagonist is a blank slate who can side with anyone. Drastically different opposing forces are able to stand on relatively equal footing, and there's a very good chance that you will find one ideal that fits you and be satisfied in supporting it. What I think's really remarkable about New Vegas is that people identify strongly enough with the story that they get invested in these camps, say by feeling like a proud NCR supporter. And I've seen some heated arguments about which side is in the right. All the things I've said earlier about how games can make you feel connected to the story because things are directly happening to you, that's still in play, but now it's combined with letting you choose who to support and who to oppose. Now there are actual moral judgments that are part of the equation. A story like this, one where you're directly involved as a player to make the big decisions, can be really thought-provoking. The problems aren't going to solve themselves in a 2-hour runtime. You have to figure things out, whether it's solving a mystery or working through a moral quandary. The challenge doesn't just lie in how effectively you can defeat enemies. The game also challenges you morally and intellectually. Aside from the matter of ideology, another great thing about a game like New Vegas is that almost every NPC can die. Even if you don't kill much of anything, it's a good thing to keep in mind because it does give the impression of permanence to your actions and the story itself. The fact that there is the potential for anyone to die means a lot. It's a more enriching experience to know that someone only lives because you allowed it or because you played a certain quest right. On the other hand, if you think a character is morally wrong, or annoying, or just ugly, or by any measure you desire, however arbitrary or petty, if a character falls short of your preferences, you can just kill them, or ignore them, choose not to engage with them, and have them not be a part of your story. You don't have to work for them, you don't have to save them, and so on. So it's great when games give you these sorts of options. It gives the story wider appeal if nothing else. Games can leave a lot up to you in a way that can make their stories feel more compelling. Sometimes this extends to even the basic personality of the main character, hence the phenomenon of the silent protagonist, where a game entirely eschews the characterization of its main character in favor of letting your gameplay define them. It's interesting that you can play Half-Life as a benevolent savior who puts his life on the line to protect others, or a survivor who's most concerned with himself, or a deranged killer who will murder a security guard for some extra ammo. And for the most part, the game doesn't go out of its way to contradict your preferred characterization of Gordon Freeman. You're never left to wonder if you played Gordon out of character. Another reason that player choice is so important for games is the simple matter of focus. There's a limit to how much detail you can put in any story without oversaturating it with information to the point that it becomes a burden. This goes for dialogue, action, or even visuals. Games are able to put a lot of detail into their stories that doesn't necessarily have to be engaged with. Gamers can choose to do these things on their own terms, so it doesn't interfere with the main story, unless you want it to. A lot of displays of great dialogue, attention to detail, world building, and other little things that people love in games would never have made it into the story if it weren't for the option to ignore them if you prefer. A long, meandering conversation can be fascinating, but I'm also grateful of the games that let you disengage from them if you so choose. It's not just a matter of whether you choose to talk to someone or not. You can choose to analyze all sorts of details that characterize a game's world. Be it objects arranged on the ground in a certain way, graffiti on a wall, battle-scarred terrain, the loot that a certain NPC is carrying. Subtle details like these can say a lot. For the more curious gamers, some games give you additional tools to look more closely at various entities you see and get some kind of reading on them, like the scan visor from Metroid Prime. Dark Souls famously has its item descriptions. Not really, in my opinion, the most interesting delivery mechanism for a good story unto itself, but in the context of the game, each description builds into something really interesting. Oftentimes there is significance that can be gleaned not only from the associated text, but also from where you found the item, what kinds of creatures are associated with it, what dropped it. And those things, along with the description, give the impression of a deeper meaning. Dark Souls is a game where anything you find has this backstory. It feels like everything has a deeply considered reason to be. That real thought was put into the inclusion of even the smallest things. So upgrade materials, for instance, aren't simply there for the sake of a game mechanic. They are emblematic of the faded glory of the past, yet another demonstration that the world of the game is slowly dying. Another example I really like is Pathologic, where the narrations of items give you some insight into the mindset of the weird culture of the town and their beliefs about all sorts of innocuous or not so innocuous objects. The items might be related to the backstory of the protagonist in some way, reminding them of some anecdote of the past. This kind of subtextual storytelling, whether it's item descriptions, NPC dialogue, or reading text logs, can do a lot of heavy lifting, especially in games with minimalistic narratives where information is not easily attained passively. And it puts you in the mindset of an explorer, while giving the impression that such a minimalistic story is not simply a shallow, underdeveloped one, but that it's instead a story that withholds information, challenging the player to solve a grander mystery. That there is a well-developed, clearly laid out, robust backstory in the developer's notes, but we, playing as a random adventurer, are simply not privy to all the details. These worlds are very exciting to explore and try to decipher the stories of. Information gathering tools like these, be they item descriptions, a scan visor, or radio conversations, all have the benefit of being easily ignorable to the uninterested, but they tend to draw the player's interest because you're incentivized to use these tools because of the gameplay advice they offer. Come for the gameplay tips, stay for the lore dump. Whatever form it might take, this sort of content doesn't impose itself upon the player. Of course, I'm the type of player to examine every environmental object and talk to every NPC, but let's be realistic here. I don't think most people have the kind of patience that I do for this kind of thing. So it's for the best that games make such a thing optional. Games give you a chance to find hidden secrets that add detail to the world. Some are more overtly connected to a straightforward story than the Dark Souls example. Like having a secret you can find that foreshadows some plot twist or a character's motivation well before you were supposed to learn about it. It's another way for games to have variable outcomes to their stories for different players and acts as a sort of reward for thorough investigators. Effective foreshadowing is a common staple in games because the relevant details can be overlooked or consciously fixated upon depending on the player. Notable details can be included without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Details in movies take a certain amount of bandwidth simply due to the fact that screen time is at a premium. There's a hard limit to it. This is sort of generalizing, but take the proverbial Chekhov's gun. In a movie, if there's a shot that lingers on a gun mounted on a wall, you know it's there. But in a game, there's always a chance that you never go into that room to begin with. Things like that can be much more easily overlooked. In games, players are free to look at stuff as long as they please, taking as much time to soak in the environment, appreciate the details, and speculate on what they see as necessary. A player can see a tower looming in the distant landscape, which they're left to wonder about whether they'll get to go there. You can travel off the beaten path and acquire something that will be important later. A character might reveal a deeper backstory if you press them long enough. You might find a memo that's a smoking gun. An in-game book might contain an intricately woven narrative on its own. So much world-building information can be held within a game. No one would want to see a TV show interrupted by having the main character sit down and start reading an encyclopedia, but such a thing can be a very interesting opportunity for someone playing a game. The great thing about games is these details only make themselves known if you decide to engage with them, which rewards inquisitive players without bogging down the pacing for those who just want to proceed through the game. If you're not interested, you don't have to read the encyclopedia. You don't have to study the details of the map or read the item descriptions of every bit of equipment you have. It's just one of those things that games really have a knack for sometimes, and that I really appreciate. All this is to say, when it comes to games versus other media, you're not quite as much of a captive audience. You can ignore things when you please and make consequential decisions if you want the story to take a certain course. And that reflects a broader strength of games, which is the ability for them to respect your choices. It's often better when video games let you blaze a path in your own preferred direction while respecting your choices. Respecting your choices doesn't just mean patting you on the back and giving you everything you want all the time. Sometimes it manifests in the form of risk and reward. A game might punish the player for lack of forethought, making it all the more rewarding when you actually consider things carefully. Some games have really made me think when my well-intended actions led to some negative outcome that I didn't anticipate. It's easy to judge others by the consequences of their actions, but what about when you make things worse because you just mindlessly went through the motions in some quest? Ignoring all the warning signs, not reading between the lines, and treating it like a milk run instead of actually thinking about what's happening. No one promised you that uncritically following quest markers and doing the first thing anyone asked you to do would guarantee the best ending. Gameplay can also serve to take you out of your ivory tower. You might think you are a forgiving person who would always turn the other cheek and prefer to play a game that way. But when the chips are down, are you going to select the merciful option for a group that's continually threatening you? A group that will oppose your gameplay interests if you show them mercy? And who would pass up the catharsis of punishing an enemy who brought them a great deal of frustration? Relatedly, I should probably mention Undertale. I've always thought one of the most interesting aspects of Undertale's story is the genocide playthrough. It allows you to see the characters in a very different light. Almost everyone comes out looking a little bit better when faced with the adversity of imminent doom. It really brings out the best in people, seeing a horrible nightmare in the form of the unstoppable force of the player descend upon their world. And you get to see who stands against it, who retains their humility, and who claims newfound honor. Seeing the characters in this version of the story leaves you with a better understanding of who they are deep down, and it's a side to them you'd never see without the genocide playthrough. There are also a lot of story developments that change the foundational understanding of the game's lore that you can only see if you do this run. The basic rules of the world are turned inside out, and you find a lot of hidden truths, and the simple fact that the game is capable of such an immense tonal shift relative to the normal playthrough is pretty fascinating unto itself. And of course, the game has a funny way of remembering your actions as the player, even if you reload a prior save, which leads to some interesting meta-commentary only possible in a video game like this. The contrast between a genocide playthrough and the normal run makes the game more interesting than the sum of its parts. It's interesting when gameplay is used to make a point or demonstrate a theme, and it's effective in just the same way that gameplay is effective in getting a game's tone across. It's also great when a game allows you to see so many different things in subsequent playthroughs. And it's not just about good or bad endings, good or bad playthroughs. It can just be exploring different, relatively innocuous choices. Even if there are choices you disfavor, it might be worth trying them just to learn more about a game you like and are interested in. Movies like Fight Club or The Sixth Sense might be whole different movies in a way the second time you watch them, but games can take that kind of differential understanding to a much greater extent, thanks to the capacity for things to actually unfold differently, offering entirely different perspectives. A specific storytelling device I like is when games express what happens not just if you make a bad call, but also if you lose. Showing some aftermath of a game over, or a bad ending that shows your town in ruins, or just characters verbally reacting to your death before you revert to a checkpoint. It's a great world-building opportunity, and these kinds of things can be a sobering reminder of the gravity of your quest, demonstrating to you exactly what's at stake. Or they might just offer a bit more to learn about the setting and how it would look without your continued success. Hopefully seeing the cost of failure will motivate you to try harder. Sometimes great emotional resonance can be attained just through regular, unscripted gameplay. The variations in how your gameplay experience unfolds can add to any game. You might get some random drop that drastically alters the course of your playthrough, or things might go wrong in so many ways you can only laugh about it. On the other hand, you can have unexpected moments of drama or poignance. Maybe the most unassuming NPC happens to step up and save your life. Maybe you win a tough fight with 1 HP. Your story might have all kinds of emotional range. There's a layer to the story of each game that is just improv, some of which is left up to you and some of which is random, being up to the game. There's something interesting about how games have these open possibilities such that you might see a new thing happen that you might not have thought was possible even after having played a game for years. Gameplay can represent a great number of possibilities. Choices don't just matter as far as getting the proper ending slide and making the specified scripted quest unfold according to the way you want it to. You might also feel inclined to help out the random generic NPCs just because it's the right thing to do, or you might go at things from the opposite perspective and try to depopulate the entire game world. Either way, you can keep invested in the moment-to-moment gameplay. You can have compelling, unique, interesting outcomes arise from something without any pre-written, developer-made narrative. In this way, games allow your actions to contribute to your story, a narrative driven by emergent gameplay. I'm sure plenty of people have felt something when in, say, Minecraft, when a creeper blows up their house or their dog gets killed and you just have to keep going or make a whole new world because there's no save to reload. Emergent stories, of course, are a huge part of why people play games like RimWorld or Dwarf Fortress. Plenty of stories have been told, and videos have been posted of some crazy incidents in a game where some memorable thing happens that wasn't planned out by a developer at all. Sandbox games are often deliberately designed to capitalize on this, and can bring all sorts of dramatic outcomes in this way. To a degree, interesting and memorable random occurrences are possible in all sorts of games, but games such as roguelikes might not have any rigidly defined story, being built with a minimalistic, player-centric approach, where the storytelling is entirely deferred to the gameplay, which speaks for itself. Through such widely varied gameplay possibilities, the drama enhanced by the gravity of long-term consequences. Your run is the story. The threat of something like permadeath is dreadful enough to carry the entire narrative very far, almost on its own. Lots of memorable things happen to the player in these kinds of games despite a lack of scripted sequences or dialogue. Have you ever lost something and felt its absence for a great while afterwards? Games can instill this sort of feeling in unexpected ways, especially if they make you roll with the consequences. I remember a run in a roguelike called Caves of Cut where I was playing as a two-handed weapon user, rifles and greatswords, and I got my arm ripped off. And that put a damper on the progression of my two-handed weapon build. This was not an easy issue to overcome. I felt the loss of that arm, but I wasn't able to turn back. There was no save to restore, and so I pressed on and kept going. That was a very memorable challenge to try to work through, and I survived for a pretty long time after that, getting in many encounters that would have been easier with a whole nother arm. But the experience was deeper and more memorable for that challenge. There was no pre-written guarantee that I could finish some quest and receive a reward to get a new arm. I forged my own path. Progressing through the game, maybe getting a new arm along the way, was all up to me, in a world that didn't care about me, a world that wasn't catered to fit my specific needs, the way other games might gratify you with a quest to cure any malady or injury you could ever receive. The scenario I went through was something personal to me, and it was something that had the groundwork laid for it, but it wasn't specifically planned, it just happened that way. Another game where emergent situations made a big impression on me was the original Ghost Recon. For the most part, the story is pretty bare bones. Missions are largely random wet work without much of a narrative connection. You have a pool of generic soldiers from which you build a team. Each character's abilities improve for every mission they survive, making your veteran soldiers a valuable asset. They'll also retain injury for a while if they get hurt on a mission, and death is permanent. These aren't just NPCs though. Each of these characters is playable on a mission. You can swap between your teammates. You might live a heroic moment as some character, or be saved by him yourself only to see him unceremoniously killed in action later. I mentioned Republic Commando earlier, and it's sort of like that, but in that game, you have predefined characters with specific personalities. Somehow, even without that, I found this Ghost Recon example compelling, because it's the story of your guys, as it is, which feels kind of personal and significant. Very high stakes. Any game's story feels more real when your friends have skin in the game just like you do, and their loss comes with the gameplay effect of having one less gun, drastically enhancing the suspense of any danger you're in, because there can be so much of a greater consequence to your mistakes than dying and getting booted back to the last checkpoint. And this can lead to a lot of interesting emergent scenarios where the game tells a story of your involvement in something greater than keeping your own hide safe. A story told through gameplay alone. What could be a tragedy might just as easily be you going above and beyond to save your friends. Ghost Recon had a lot of emotional valence to simple moment-to-moment gameplay. And this is generally true of games that have more for you to look out for than yourself. It's one thing if you can't take care of yourself and you get sent back to the last checkpoint. Who can you protect? I've made some mentions of how gameplay makes things feel more authentic, and I want to give a clear example of what I mean. In movies, things have a way of being resolved at the last second for dramatic effect, and it doesn't necessarily feel realistic, especially when you see it happen so many times. For instance, if the hero has to disarm a bomb, you just know he's probably gonna do it when the timer is at about 5 seconds or less. Well, they could have put any number there, it's a movie. It happens as it was written. But events that unfold in unscripted gameplay lack this layer of artificiality. As a great example, one that I'm really glad I recorded, I was playing the climactic level of Command & Conquer Generals. The enemy had a nuke about to launch and kill a bunch of my guys. My infantry was capturing the building. Doing so would neutralize the threat of a launch. You can see the timer here at the top of the screen. There was a tense, teeth-clenching moment where all I could do was watch and wonder if I made the right decision to capture the launch site instead of just blowing it up.
General,
When the timer ticked down to 0 right before the AI had the chance to launch, and they launched those nukes instantly. It was like, ladies and gentlemen, we got him, when my guy announced that the building is ours. There was no contrivance that went into this. No designer chose to have this be the outcome. It just happened. And it was perfect. If that kind of scenario happened in a movie, I would have kind of rolled my eyes and thought, oh yeah, right. Of course they stopped the launch with the 0 on the timer. What are the odds of that? But this was an unscripted moment in a sandbox-style RTS campaign level, O ye of little faith. It really wasn't likely at all. Just a perfect storm that occurred by sheer coincidence, mostly due to my terrible planning, where I decided to capture the building way beyond the point of reason. And I'll admit, games don't usually have things go this well, in terms of gameplay perfectly aligning with the narrative. But when the stars align, a game isn't just telling you a story, it's having you experience the story. You live it out. The sort of learn-as-you-play approach to storytelling isn't the sole domain of sandbox games. In any game, even one with a rigid, predefined story like Halo Combat Evolved, gameplay can be used to convey story information rather more directly than the dialogue or text-based approaches that I've discussed earlier. When people recount the story of Halo, most would probably talk about the stuff that happens in the cutscenes, maybe some of the environmental storytelling, or they'd mention the in-game dialogue. But much of the game's story is presented within gameplay. The game does a lot to characterize the factions through common in-game interactions. One of the most famous interactions in the game is the way grunts react to the presence of the elite and the loss of them. When elites are around, grunts tend to be quite a bit braver, being less prone to panic upon receiving injuries or seeing their comrades die. But without any elites, they are far more skittish and prone to losing cohesion easily. The death of elites is a common source of panic among grunts. In most games, it makes sense to kill the weakest enemies first. You might think that to be the case in Halo. After all, grunts and elites both shoot you just as hard. So the instinct would be to neutralize each trigger puller as efficiently as possible, but Halo enables you to target enemy leaders to throw the unit into disarray. The storytelling aspect of this is that understanding the enemy rank structure allows you to exploit it for gameplay purposes. It's a tactical option to keep in mind at all times. It can save your life. And so every encounter you have with the Covenant is a reminder of their hierarchy. This small detail characterizes the Covenant. The grunts are fearful and lower ranking than the mighty elites, whose commanding presence makes the grunts more confident in battle. The elites, meanwhile, are stern, iron-hearted warriors who seem to fear nothing. Just a simple gameplay interaction lets you extrapolate a lot of detail about the setting without the game needing to spare any words for it. Nobody tells you this. There's no voiceover where Cortana says, "By the way, Chief, try killing the elites first." It's something you learn from playing, and so it couldn't come across more naturally. There's more to it than just the fact that this alien outranks that one. You also get a sense of the disparity of their hierarchy by taking a look at which species seems more poorly trained, higher in number, and lacking in equipment like expensive energy shielding. And that might inform you of the role the Covenant places on species in its society. But it's also there just to humanize the aliens, so to speak. It's not just a gameplay tactical option. In absence of a leader, they will rout even if they see you with a scary weapon. The developers didn't do that just to make the game easier or to make it more fun. They did it to make these characters feel like real, responsive creatures, afraid for their lives, instead of having it feel like you're fighting mindless computer programs. Immersion is a bit of a buzzword, but Details like this build into it, making the game and its characters feel more alive. An additional way that the game characterizes the different species you see is the rather morbid reaction you see upon sticking enemies with plasma grenades, which upon contact attach to a target for a few seconds before detonating. They cannot be removed, and death is guaranteed for almost all targets. Humans, as well as lesser Covenant species, react to this with abject terror, much as you'd expect. But the elites are a noble race of warriors who thrive in battle and have strong will to fight. If you stick an elite, he doesn't panic, he gets mad. He'll yell in rage before he tries to run you down to take you with him. You see this and you understand that they are a fanatical or courageous race and they are not afraid of death. A subtle detail shows that there's a weaker side even to elites though. While elites generally react to being stuck with defiance and anger, that only applies in the heat of battle. If you sneak up on an elite and stick him with the plasma grenade while he's oblivious to any danger, the sudden shock sends him into just as much of a panic as anything else, because he hasn't had the chance to steel himself. You can see that they are no less capable of terror than humans or grunts when caught off guard. So it's not as simple as they're a species that's incapable of fear biologically. That warrior mindset is what causes them to charge at you when you've doomed them. It's a state of mind that they only experience during the excitement of combat. It's kind of a strange way to deliver some world building, but it works. Players just stumble into great little storytelling moments like this just from gameplay interactions. A total curveball in the game's story proper is the introduction of the Flood, but they don't just change the course of the plot, they also change the methods by which the player must engage in combat. Say you decide to use your tried and true method of hitting enemies with plasma grenades, an action which stops most enemies in their tracks because they lose their nerve when they're suddenly faced with the inevitability of their death in a few seconds. Try it on the Flood, and you'll quickly learn that they have no nerve to lose. They just keep marching at you, unfettered, with absolutely no reaction. And it hits you that this is not a living creature that understands, much less cares about, what being stuck with a plasma grenade means. It's just a mindless killing machine. It has no sense of self-preservation, so mortal terror is not a weapon you can employ against them the way it works on other enemies. They're zombies. They don't have emotions. They don't panic. They don't dodge grenades or anything. The Flood in the story is a relentless force seeking only to consume with no fear weighing them down. And that is exactly what you see reflected in gameplay, with their mindless, unwavering effort to consume all life being yet another gameplay obstacle that you have to adapt your tactics to. It's not all totally centered on the player either. You often see the Covenant and the Flood battle each other in Halo. You'll immediately notice that you have two enemies that can be directed to weaken each other before you make the final strike. So you're rewarded for paying attention to these fights and not making yourself the center of attention or wading into the crossfire. And something that quickly becomes apparent if you sit back and watch is that the highly advanced alien empire that has nearly wiped out the human race is now on the back foot. They lose almost every single engagement to this new threat, this all-consuming monstrosity. What do you think is going to happen in the long term? This is not just a gameplay feature, it's a storytelling mechanism that shows you the direction this war is headed and puts into perspective how important your role in the story is. Gameplay is an opportunity for a game's story to have its cake and eat it too. A game just lets the chips fall where they may and lets the ensuing events speak for themselves. While there's something to be said of the consistency and accuracy to the creator's vision that a predetermined script can present, you can rest assured that players will figure out what a creator's intended takeaway was when it's in their best interests. Otherwise, they will suffer the consequences of failing the lore check and learn the hard way. People are going to carefully investigate these avenues because it helps them to beat the game. Something that sticks out to me in a lot of games is that some of them conspicuously avoid showing your protagonist actually fight in cutscenes. To have them do that kind of thing isolates you from the cool stuff, making you a passive observer instead of you being in your customary role as the active participant. The time for the protagonist to do the cool stuff is generally when you're controlling them, And besides, if your protagonist starts fighting in a way that's completely different from the way you play the game, you might start to question things. Maybe your preferences aren't canon. Maybe you're playing the game out of character. Or maybe the person you're playing as just doesn't feel like the same person you see in the cutscene that other characters are talking to. It's the same motivation behind a silent protagonist, where developers don't want a character intended to represent you to act out of turn. It's a way of keeping the player in the story. And this brings us back to a lot of stuff I've touched on earlier, like how powerful stories can come to fruition through gameplay, or how much it can mean to involve the player directly in storytelling scenarios. It's all pointing in the same direction. A gameplay-centric, player-focused approach is an effective way to tell a story in a video game. You probably are familiar with the show-don't-tell rule for movies. I'll explain it anyway. In a book, a long monologue recounting past events is not a big disruption to the flow of the story because, not to demean the value of prose, but words are words in literature. To have events recounted in dialogue is not much different from a narration describing them. It's all text either way. But movies speak a different language, a visual one, where dialogue is more of an ancillary element compared to books. In a movie, dialogue is more distinct from the primary means of conveying the story. So in a movie, if you wanted to portray a character recounting some past event, you could have a very long monologue where the character sits there on screen verbally describing things. In other words, telling rather than showing. This is usually not the preferred approach, because if it were, say, an exciting adventure movie, such a scene might be boring and out of place. So a lot of movies would have this conversation begin before cutting to a flashback that represents the content of the story that's being recounted. That way the movie is still presenting things more visually, thus keeping things in the language of cinematography. Lessons like this bring forth the common aphorism, show don't tell. It's something filmmakers do well to keep in mind so that they're taking advantage of the medium instead of fighting it. In the same sense that movies are often wise to abide by the show don't tell guideline, for video games I'd pose a similar rule. You might say, play, don't show, to complete the analogy. When following this guideline, a well-designed game will have the pieces of its story fall into place. It ensures that a player's interpretation of the protagonist isn't contradicted by what the character does or says in a cutscene. Say a game clearly wants to enable you to do a pacifist run, well, that wouldn't mean very much if you saw the protagonist kill a guy in a cutscene and enjoy it. You wouldn't want a character you're playing as to suffer from a bout of cutscene-induced incompetence either. Why show something when the player can feel it, experience it firsthand? It's usually better to defer the storytelling to the gameplay when possible. It prevents the gameplay and the story from feeling disjointed, which is where you get the dreaded ludonarrative dissonance. Through gameplay, games have a lot of power to impress a feeling upon the player directly, and it's wise for video games to use this ability if they want to play to their strengths and tell the best story a game can tell. I want to mention the issue of adaptations of video games. This is what inspired the video and why I made so many comparisons to movies. I've given some thought to this issue with how everyone seems to generally hate video game adaptations. An explanation I hear is that video games just don't have great stories to begin with, so of course the movies based on them are bad with such an awful source material, but I don't think that's it, because then it should be very easy to win over the established fan base on basis of story. Because how could you possibly do worse in a medium that can actually tell a half-decent story, right? But in reality, established fans tend to be the biggest complainers about the stories of adaptations. Are the fans unreasonable? What's setting their expectations of the story so high? Well, consider all the stuff I've talked about in this video. A lot of the things that do make video game stories good are completely orthogonal to the stories of movies or books. I thought Resident Evil gave a profound feeling when playing it because of how it immerses the player in this really interesting gameplay scenario. So consider a Resident Evil movie. What are you left with? All that stuff about the safe rooms is gone. The tension the player feels when making hard choices and wondering if they'll survive, that's gone. All the really good stuff is gone. All you're left with is zombies, basically. It's all just window dressing to the really meaningful part of the game. the player experience, and that window dressing is now at the forefront. Video games have a different language than other media, and this means that a lot is going to get lost in translation in any adaptation. Any kind of variable outcomes, player-centric narrative, none of that is going to have any way to make the cut. So you're basically adapting a shell of the game, and a lot of these adaptations mostly just end up drawing from the aesthetics, rather than really promoting the same kind of feeling inspired by the original game when you factor the gameplay into it. Anyway, thanks for watching what so far is my longest video by a lot. I don't mean to put games on a pedestal here. There are some inherent weaknesses of video games as a storytelling medium. They're not just better than everything else, but that would be a topic for another video.